Thank you, Pearl, and good afternoon, and welcome to Rights and Recourse, a program that tackles constitutional human rights and legal issues, bringing you information and analysis. My name is Dumile Mateta. Remember, you can also be part of our discussion today by calling our studio line on 011 714 5497 or 5498, or tweet us at Rights and Recourse. Alternatively, you can email your thoughts to rightsandrecourse@sabc.co.za. November 2017 will go down in the history of Zimbabwe as the beginning of the end of Robert Gabriel Mugabe's 37 years in power. A tumultuous week finally culminated in his resignation on November 21st. One cannot understate the widespread jubilation at the demise of President Mugabe, but the optimism could be misplaced because it does not deal directly with the dearth of democracy in Zimbabwe. On Friday, Zimbabwe inaugurated only its second executive president with the ascension of Emmerson Dambudzo Mnangagwa to the presidency, replacing President Robert Gabriel Mugabe. Today on Rights and Recourse, we're taking a look at the future of this Southern African country under the leadership of His Excellency, Interim President Emmerson Dambudzo Mnangagwa. Could he be the man to rebuild the Zimbabwe ruins? But first, let's have a look at this insert.
I, Emmerson Dambudzo Mnangagwa, swear that as the President of the Republic of Zimbabwe, I will be faithful to Zimbabwe and obey, uphold, and defend the Constitution and all other laws of Zimbabwe, and that I will promote whatever will advance and oppose whatever may harm Zimbabwe, that I will protect and promote the rights of the people of Zimbabwe, that I will discharge my duties with all my strength to the best of my knowledge and ability, and true to the dictates of my conscience, and that I will devote myself to the well-being of Zimbabwe and its people. So help me God.
To discuss today's topic, we're joined in the studio by Professor David Moore of the University of Johannesburg, Department of Anthropology and Development Studies. Mr. Ngobizi Tamlilo, a human rights lawyer, and lastly, in our Pretoria studio, we're joined by Dr. Martin Rupia, an associate professor from the Institute for African Renaissance Studies at UNISA and a retired Army lieutenant. Gentlemen, good afternoon and welcome to Rights and Recourse.
Good afternoon.
An interesting time to live in, or the Chinese normally say, if they have a very good relationship with Zimbabwe, say we live in interesting times.
Absolutely. I think it's an important period in Zimbabwe's history. But I think for us to be able to properly understand what has happened and therefore properly understand where we are going, we should take off from the position that understands that what happened in Zimbabwe was a coup. In other words, we allowed the military to be involved in civilian politics. Alternatively, we must then accept that Zimbabwe has always been a military state run by former guerrillas who just decided to separate themselves from those who took suits and tie and occupied government and those who remained in the barracks wearing uniform. So the poly, the lubricant of Zimbabwe's politics remains the military. And therefore that tells us that this change that has happened is merely a resolution of a periodic factional battle in ZANU, which solved a generational problem, in the sense that Robert Mugabe's generation had to hand over to Emmerson Mnangagwa's generation, which is backed by General Chiwenga, who reported to Emmerson Mnangagwa during the liberation struggle. What therefore this suggests is that in the future, ZANU-PF is likely to enter into another phase of succession battle, which succession battle again will have to be resolved along similar ways in which this resolution has been done. So while it is important to celebrate and to ululate the demise of Robert Mugabe, we must understand that this is a celebration in December. January is coming, we still need to pay our school fees, and therefore a lot more is coming. And I think that in the celebration in the celebrations that are happening, people must remain alive to the challenges that come.
Professor Dr. Rupia, let me come to you. Ngobizita says it was a coup. A friend of mine from Zimbabwe was saying to me, I don't understand this thing people are talking about. They want to do it by the constitution because immediately an army steps in governance, the constitution is automatically suspended. Can you hear me, Professor?
Well, thank you, Dumi. I think the first point of departure must be for all of us Zimbabweans to understand where the country is. And the country is at a point where the ruling party, after 1980, almost forgot to switch off violence for political purposes. So now that we have a new government installed on Friday, with President Mnangagwa, all Zimbabweans, including the ruling party, must begin to understand that there is a point where a liberation movement has to switch off the methods of using violence for political purposes and begin to invoke constitutional means. Certainly, one of the characteristics of the previous regime was the absence of rule of law. The perception that even citizens constituted enemies, where the state would use state assets and institutions to go after citizens. There are a number of areas that we must not forget, but certainly put into context. And going forward, we must not forget that there was a widely consulted constitution after 2019, which the former president and ruling party refused to align to the country's laws. And so as we go forward, one is hoping that the liberation movement begins to understand that if you are going to deepen democracy and observe citizens' rights, you have to begin to abandon the use of violence.
Let me come to the studio
and
here.
I'm hearing very positive signs that are coming from the president so far.
Okay, you're going to go on. Let me come to the studio to Dr. Moore. Dr. Moore, in 1980, when Zimbabwe gained its independence, the whole of Africa and the world had high hopes for this Southern African nation, and depending on who you believe, it was the breadbasket of Southern Africa. I heard somebody say that was not the case. How did we get here? Where did Zimbabwe go wrong?
Well, I think that does relate to the issue that my two colleagues have been discussing. We have on one side, this was a coup. We have on the other side, there were constitutional dimensions to the thing. I think the coup was a soft coup or a con coup.
Well, the man is not there anymore.
I call it a con coup because, first of all, the army said, this is just a party thing. You can go, but he didn't go. So then they went further. But as they were going further, house arrest and so on, they mobilized people in the streets. They tried to follow the rules of parliament for an impeachment. So there's been, people like Malilo have been struggling for democracy. The MDC has been struggling for democracy. The university students, civil society have pushed this regime into a state where it has to at least pretend. Now that's a small little wedge, but we have to focus on that. To get back to 1980, I'm an historian, and I have studied the Liberation War. The contradictions within that Liberation War are coming to the fold again. In the 70s, in both parties, ZAPU, led by Joshua Nkomo, and in the mid-70s, ZANU, in the camps, a young generation challenging the old generation, wiped out, sent to prison, and so on. We can see ethnic, class, ideological, generational divisions coming at these points in time. So it didn't surprise me. This was going on in the 70s. In the 1980s, the world was looking for a nice place in Southern Africa to be free, and the communists didn't come into power. Robert Mugabe didn't like the Soviet Union. So within months, there was the beginnings of Guguruhundi, the beginnings of wiping out ZAPU.
We'll go to the Guguruhundi thing. I just want to come back to something else which you mentioned, that the army said this is a party thing. My concern there is the army in Zimbabwe partisan?
I think maybe in answering that question, let me also attempt a bite on the question you put to Professor Moore. I mean, by no equity at all, he's far much more knowledgeable to me on the historical aspect of Zimbabwe. But I think I would attempt a slightly different answer that says Zimbabwe's liberation came through the barrel of the gun. In other words, it came through a liberation movement. And therefore, the question is, what is the task of a liberation movement? If the immediate task of a liberation movement is the demise of the colonial state and ushering a different era, the question then becomes, is a liberation movement able to deal with democracy? Particularly if it has contradictions that are unresolved pre the fall of the colonial state. What is the ideological clarity of this liberation movement? What does it intend to do beyond the demise of the liberation movement? So my suggestion would be that where it got wrong is that beyond the demise of the colonial state, ZANU-PF as a liberation movement did not have a proper grasp of what to do in a democratic state. In other words, liberation movements have a limited lifespan. They have a particular mandate to defeat a colonial state. Beyond that, it is unable to deal with a democratic state unless it undergoes fundamental changes. So what we are seeing now are contradictions, as Professor David Moore is saying, which are happening in ZANU-PF, which will continue to happen, which is why I'm saying this is a periodic resolution of a contradiction in the sense that the hierarchy of liberation politics has been respected, in the sense that Robert Mugabe has handed over to Mnangagwa as opposed to Grace Mugabe, which would have been an aberration to liberation politics. Just imagine Chiwenga, who used to use an AK-47 as his pillow. He knows the different sounds of AK-47s saluting Grace Mugabe, a lady that was probably in her nappies when Chiwenga was already in the heart of the liberation movement. So this succession makes sense because it respects the hierarchy of liberation politics. The question now is, what happens after Mnangagwa? That is really the question we must face. Because if Mnangagwa says elections are going to happen next year, yes, he will say so, because it is the same way as you indicated of 1980, where Bob Marley sang about Zimbabwe. But the question is... I
heard that song reverberating through the stadium on Friday.
Yes. Zimbabwe is the only country Bob Marley sang by name. And that tells you the importance of this country. But we want elections as a currency of political transaction to the extent they confirm the status quo. So the election coming in next year will most likely be free of outward violence, precisely because the chances of ZANU-PF winning that election are clear. Because Zimbabweans now know that for any transition to happen, it requires the support of the military. The opposition is in disarray now. Very soon the opposition will enter its own fray of succession problems. So coming into the next election, ZANU-PF is likely to win, and therefore there is a need to have those elections. But when again we have another 2008, when the liberation movement faces the real prospect of losing state power through an election, we'll be back to this situation again.
Let me come back to you. I will come back to you. Let me take this call from Chris is he in Benoni on the Eastern End? Chris, good afternoon and welcome to Rights and Recourse.
Thank you for taking my call, and greetings to you all, the panel, and all your guests. I have a little bit of knowledge of the Zim history. I was training there as a liberation fighter under APLA in 1993 in that Zimbabwe Military Academy. what I observed in Zim politics and military, there is a denialism of tribalism. That country has got serious tribal differences. If you check now, the history of Mr. Mugabe and Mnangagwa is inclined to tribes again. Is here we are having this Zulu versus the Karanga faction, sorry to say. And if you check it properly, it's like the gentleman who was saying this Zipra and Zanla fight. I had one commander of the Zipra who was the sole survivor of the whole company that was poisoned with cyanide in the water reserves at their assembly point somewhere down in Lower where he was telling me to say, hey, these people, you know, we are so divided with tribal, along tribal lines. My fear is now, with these people who are so excited, did they position themselves in a new Zimbabwe that is inclusive of all the tribes? Is the nation ready to say the mistakes of the past and point them to say we did this wrongly along the tribal lines? Or
Chris, let us answer that question. Let's answer the question you asked, the last part you asked there. But Ngobizit, I wanted to just finish my last question that you didn't answer, the part that Dr. Moore said that the party is saying, no, this is the army said this is a party issue. Is the army in Zimbabwe factional or not factional as such, partisan? That's the word I wanted.
It's undeniable. Because that takes me back to what I was explaining, that on the eve of democracy, these guerrillas who operated during the colonial regime divided themselves, and some took uniforms and continued to operate as the army. Some took ties and went into government, because Chiwenga himself was a political commissar. So now, in a democratic state, you tell him he cannot participate in politics when the very cause of his involvement was hinged around politics. So when the army enters politics like this, to them it's not an alien thing. It is normal because they have always participated in politics in that sense. In fact, they would consider it as their revolutionary duty to enter into politics in this sense. That's why they call it correction. That to the extent you correct whatever is happening in ZANU-PF, you have in fact corrected what must happen in the state, which is exactly where they are. So to them, it is not partisanness. It is exactly what they are called upon to do.
Professor Rupia in Pretoria, somebody was saying, I don't know whether you want to come in on some of the issues that were raised.
Yes, I did some of them, but I think it's correct to say, as my colleague Nobizita is saying, the ruling party has drawn the military into politics. And what we have seen is a succession within the ruling party using part of the military institutions. Now that is a legacy that is now with us. And it's a contradiction going forward. Asking a wider question, what is the relationship between the Chief of Defense Staff, General Chiwenga, and the new president? Certainly, President Mnangagwa indicated that throughout the very brutal and difficult transition, he was in constant touch with the generals. And so your caller from Benoni, Chris, indicated the flaws within the Zimbabwean society, in which there are people that are divided, on language, on regionalism, etc. The point is, to what extent can the new government use the constitution to build those flaws and to overcome them in the end?
Dr. Moore, in his inaugural address, President Mnangagwa made this profound statement, and I quote, "The task before us is much bigger than competing for political office. Let's all work together." What does it mean? Why is this reference to, is he referring to factions?
I think he is. And when he spoke to ZANU-PF when he first came in, he mentioned traitors. He mentioned that he'd been poisoned. People talk about the ice cream cone. You know, so he is making reference to that. And also when Mugabe made his non-resignation speech on Sunday night from ZANU-PF, he was talking in this very fatherly, kind of priestly way about overcoming these generational divides. But I don't think, contrary to you, that this is a generational shift. We don't even know how old Mnangagwa is. He might be 75. He might be 82. This was.
You want to say President Mnangagwa is like a soccer player. We don't know how old he is.
Well, it has something to do with when he was released from prison. So the generational challenge was put to the side. So that hasn't been resolved. These ethnic issues that your caller was talking about haven't been resolved. They're not nearly as open as they are in Kenya, but they're there. And the army, well, you know, Mugabe was seen as stacking them. But to get back to this question of the relationship between the state and the party, which of course...
State of the army.
State, army, and
the party.
And military, and party. Which of course is at the root of what your question is. How will that eventuate throughout the next few years? You know, will the army be more involved in elections like it has been in 2008? So what we've seen is a fusion of these units, which, you know, liberals like to think are always separate, but they never really are, even in the West. But in any case, we have a fusion of party, state, and military, which comes through the Liberation War. There's always some challenges to it. And we have a fusion now, even in business. We have these generals who have been put in charge of parastatal corporations. We have Mnangagwa, who was high up in the military, defense minister, I think, at the time of the DRC war, with the war in the Congo. These people made a lot of money from that war, from setting up companies to provide uniforms for the army, to bringing back diamonds, to even have Billy Rottenbach for a while be in charge of Jekamin.
I know that name.
Yes. So these relationships are very, very tight. You could think, some people compare this to the Egypt, you know, the Arab Spring. Well, there you had people in the streets and the military comes back in, right? That military has been established in Egypt for years and years and decades, and it is firmly entrenched in the political economy. Here you had the military bringing people in on the streets and the military taking off. And it's still in the process of doing business.
Well, when we come back, we will talk about governance, or we'll listen to a speech by President Mnangagwa. And if you want to call us, you can call us on 011-714-5497 or 5498, or you can tweet us at Rights Recourse, or send us an email, your email to rightsandrecourse@sabc.co.za. Stay with us.
Phones, cloud systems and robots have taken over a lot of what used to be done manually.
Our accounting system is actually based on the cloud.
Google nowadays can tell you where you parked your car.
And Africa's entrepreneurs are using technology to create.
With Pocket Masipala, you can basically do all the services that you would do at the municipality physically by going there, but you can now do them on a mobile app.
Join me, Spumelele Zondi, on Sundays at 9 p.m. on SABC News.
Once we cannot change the past, there is a lot we can do in the present and the future to give our nation a different, positive direction. As we do so, we should never remain hostages of our past. I thus humbly appeal to all of us that we let bygones be bygones. readily embracing each other in defining a new destiny of our beloved Zimbabwe.
The interim president there of Zimbabwe, President Emmerson Dambudzo Mnangagwa. Well, let's take this call from Sipho in Johannesburg. Sipho, good afternoon and welcome to Rights and Recourse.
Thank you very much, Boot Dumile, for this show. Boot Dumile, what I will want to ask to your guest is to talk about, from your human rights lawyer, just to touch on this court judgment that came out yesterday on between President Robert Mugabe, former president, and Mnangagwa, because some of the allegations he has raised come out from that court judgment. And I think for the election cycle, Dumile, it's very important for Zimbabwe to be ready, because the issue of raising electoral funds for that election in 2018, it is very critical. And I think finally, Dumile, is to look at what your human rights lawyer said, the civil and military relations. Can Dr. Rupia maybe touch on, maybe this time it was a military relation vis-a-vis executive, because the civilians came in at the 11th hour. But now what happened, it was the military versus executive in this juncture. So I think if you can touch on the issue of electoral cycle as well, and the last part being the civil and military relations. Thank you very much, Putu.
Thank you very much, Sipho. Let's go to Professor Rupia in Pretoria. Professor Rupia, were you surprised by what sounded like a very conciliatory speech by the president?
My view, Dumi, is that the president, of course, was working very closely with the war veterans who had been expelled. And certainly the march on Saturday, not only in Zimbabwe, but throughout the world, in London, in Washington, in Sydney, here in South Africa, Johannesburg, Cape Town, Pretoria, reflected a widespread sentiment hankering for change. And I think the president took that into account. He is not only leading the ruling party and their supporters, but the whole nation. And I was pleased, Dumi, to see in the stadium as he was inaugurated, a banner that said, "We are all Zimbabweans." Now, this is a departure from the hatred and division characteristic that we had seen in the past. So going forward, that I think has already humbled the president. And it must then begin to inform the policy options that he adopts to represent all Zimbabweans going forward.
The president made a surprise statement there. Let bygones be bygones. We should not be hostages of our past. Was he referring to a faction in ZANU-PF, or was he referring to the opposition parties? Or was he referring to President Mugabe?
Well, if we understand that this was a resolution of a factional battle, then in all likelihood, he would have been speaking to that faction of ZANU-PF. But if we consider him in his presidential capacity, we would then have to look at it as having referred to all Zimbabweans, because I think he made that statement immediately before talking about the environment which must characterize the elections in Zim. But the point really is, it is important that he says the right things. What is even much more important is that he does the right things, because this is not the first time in Zimbabwe we had this kind of speech. Robert Mugabe, when we won our independence, made a statement to the effect that we must turn our spears into plowshares, essentially saying to the white people who had colonized us for that long, let bygones be bygones. One must accept that any political transition short of a revolution requires certain concessions to be made and requires certain trade-offs to be made. And therefore, if bygones need to be bygones for the purposes of us focusing on the future rather than focusing on a 94-year-old man, then I think that discussion is worth having, because that discussion makes us talk about the opening up of the political space, that my being born after independence does not delegitimize me from having a discussion about the political future of Zimbabwe. To the extent, of course, I accept, and I'm persuaded to accept, the values of national liberation, because as African people, those need to be confirmed. So I cannot be delegitimized in participating in our politics because by accident of history, my parents decided to have me after independence.
Well, I'm coming to you, Dr. Moore, but I just want to take this call from Taylor from KwaZulu-Natal. Taylor, good afternoon. Pele, good afternoon and welcome to Rise and Recourse.
Good afternoon, Bala. I would like to ask from the panel as to what is their suggestion about the new president's speech when he says, let bygones be bygones. And at the very same time, courts are continuing to persecute those that are their adversaries. Is that still going to help Zimbabweans? Are they going to forget about the past?
Thank you very much, Pele. Pele asked a question that we answered. I asked earlier around the issue of let bygones be bygones, whether the president was referring to a faction in the ZANU-PF or to the opposition party or to Mr. Mugabe himself. The question I wanted to ask Dr. Moore was, when governance is poor, resources can be a development curse, unable to control corruption. And because one of the things, I read the charge sheet for the impeachment. The charge sheet for the impeachment said President Mugabe was being charged for not acting against corruption and failing to implement the constitution. Why did they wake up to that now? For years, opposition parties have been lamenting these very issues.
That's a good point, and that's also some bygones, perhaps, who was corrupt when. But I think the bygones does stretch out to the Gukurahundi in the 1980s, the violence in the elections, and also within...
Could you explain for the benefit of our viewers what the Gukurahundi means, what it's all about?
In the 1980s, when ZANU-PF was basically trying to make sure that they would have no opposition from ZAPU, the party with Joshua Nkomo, and the party which was historically linked with the ANC. This eventuated in thousands and thousands, some people say 20,000 Ndebele people killed in horrific violence and much more. So that's, should we let that be a bygone? Should there be a Truth and Reconciliation Commission? Internally to the party, bygones? Should Chombo is the finance minister who was in the G40 faction and was taken into custody, and now there's a trial. What's a bygone in that case? So anyway, if we go back to the corruption issue, I think we discussed a little bit before, but in the more detail, the diamonds in Marenge and Chiwedza, which flowed into the Ministry of Mines, which was led at the time by Obert Mpofu. Now, if
the money didn't go to the fiscus.
Not too much of it, but some of it went directly into the bank accounts of some civil servants. So there was a de facto Ministry of Finance, but also a place for money to go to China, Chinese companies, all sorts of issues, and the military was clearly involved. Now, do we let that bygone go by? If you look at the speech made when Emerson Mnangagwa came into ZANU-PF, who was standing by his side? Obert Mpofu, right? So you have a whole list of people. So it's going to be very difficult to charge Chombo with corruption without opening up that whole stew, that whole slew of corruption.
I think I wanted to weigh in on that.
Yeah, essentially maybe two things. One issue is what the caller was referring to about the court order that came a few days ago. And again, it takes us back to the beginning of the discussion. An attempt to constitutionalize a coup and an attempt to legalize a coup using the provisions of Section 212 of the Constitution, which essentially talks about the role of the military in Zim. If this order comes in the manner in which it did, what this then confirms legally is to say that the army is entitled to enter politics. And therefore, a precedent has already been set that the army is an integral part of politics, and to the extent there's a disequilibrium in the political environment, the army is entitled to enter. And therefore, there is a constitutional precedent.
What you're talking about, Wisdom, my apologies, is I came across a tweet by Professor Jonathan Moyo yesterday making reference to the court action apparently brought by Leonard Chikomba and Joseph Sibanda and another, where in respect of the removal of President Mugabe, and in respect of Vice President Mnangagwa, when he was still Vice President, against President Mugabe. The Minister of Defense, the Commander of the Defense Forces, and the Attorney General of Zimbabwe before the High Court the case was heard by Justice George Chiweche, and in order to following that the actions of the Defence Force in intervening to stop the takeover of his first respondent, Robert Mugabe, constitutional functions by those around him are constitutionally permissible and lawful under Section 212 of the Constitution of Zimbabwe.
Yes, that's precisely what we are saying. And we go back again to the base of our discussion that the military in Zimbabwe is an important instrument in its politics, because these relationships don't only arise post-independence, they arise from pre-independence. And therefore, their participation in politics is not alien, is not something that would be, it's something that would be frowned upon in liberal constitutional democracies, but in Zimbabwe is the norm. So through a constitutional judgment, a court judgment, we now know as a matter of law in Zimbabwe that the army is entitled to enter politics to resolve a political question. And therefore, we have set a precedent. And as I've tried to argue earlier on, it's a matter of time before we have another coup, because ZANU-PF as a liberation movement will again in a time begin to develop internal contradictions, which contradictions would require that they be resolved. And the resolution of this of those internal contradictions will again require the involvement of the army. So through a court judgment, we now know that it is constitutional in Zimbabwe through sections 2 and 2 of the Constitution for the army to enter politics.
I just want to go to, now that you've mentioned this, I want to go to Professor Rupia in Pretoria, because he was in the army. Professor, one of the problems we are dealing with here, and that is what I don't want to put words in Nobizita's mouth, but I think that's what he is alluding to. When it was apparent that the MDC might win the elections in 2008 or earlier than that, 2008, the army then stood up. Vitalis, I just remember I can't remember his surname. He was head of the army, and he said, "We are not going to salute somebody who has not fought a liberation war. When are we going to get over this in Zimbabwe?"
Certainly, one of the major reforms that we must undertake is not only a change of minds in terms of what you refer correctly to say we are not going to salute anyone who has not been part of the liberation struggle, but also even to look at the Constitution. Some of that has been embedded, in the legal frameworks, not only of the party, but also of government, in which we have to rise beyond identifying an elected leader with the liberation, credentials, which is on the table. But I wanted to go very briefly to the question that was raised when the president said we must not be beholden by history on the mistakes that we have done before crafting a destiny of a new Zimbabwe. In my view, Dumi, I think mistakes have been done in the last 37 years. The perception that has been created by the old government was of impunity and almost ignoring the circumstances of the victims. So going forward, we need a short and sharp period to respond to the issues around people that have suffered under repression before going forward. If we continue to sweep that under the carpet, the country will not go forward. But certainly, to come back to your question, we may have been provided by a legacy by the ruling party to have the military in politics, but now they have been embedded, in my view. The court judgment by Justice Chiweche saying it was an illegal removal of people that were taking state power, I don't think there was a second group arguing against what the war veterans had put forward. So we have to be very careful going forward. And in my view, simply dismiss this High Court ruling. It means very little in terms of, the political dynamics that are taking place. Of course, there has been change. The military has played a role, but I don't think the judiciary must allow itself, again, to be subjected to issuing, edicts or decisions which are questionable.
Thank you very much. If you'd like to join us in today's discussion, you can call us on 011 714 5497 or 5498 or tweet us at Rights Recourse. Alternatively, you can email your thoughts to rightsandrecourse@sabc.co.za. Stay with us.
funeral policy.
No matter the sacrifices you've made or the hours you've worked, you can't always say yes. AVBOB's cashback funeral plan not only provides funeral insurance for your family, but also helps you to say yes to life's little extras more often. Because for every 5 claim-free years, you'll get your 5th year's premiums based on your monthly premium value paid back in cash. SMS Cash 1 to 41790 at no cost, and we'll call you. AVBOB, we're here for you.
If you want an AVBOB representative to contact you, SMS Cash 1 and your name to 41790.
Our desire, all of us, both countries, is that we should have the economy as well as trade that favors both countries. That is what we are looking for.
All we are saying is that let us have fair trade where Zimbabwe produces products to export to South Africa. There should be a readiness to accept that.
President Mugabe, they're talking with at a press conference when he visited South Africa a couple of weeks ago, I think a month ago, to revive what was a collaboration between the two countries. One of the biggest problems, Professor, in Zimbabwe is the revival of the economy. And President Mugabe was not the kind of person who was friendly to the West. But it would seem to me, listening to President Mnangagwa, that the gravity of the economic situation has forced Zimbabwe, the Zimbabwean government, into a process of re-engagement with the West.
That could well be the case. I think the international community, whatever you want to call it, was hoping that there would be a transitional government, 2 or 3 years, and that there could be a package of aid. Mnangagwa even has mentioned compensation to the white farmers, private tenure on the small farms.
And Theresa May had sent his Minister for Africa, for development, African development.
Yeah. And you know the sweeteners would be money, and the carrot, or maybe a sweet carrot, would be okay. Democratize, let the media be free. Let the parties in the opposition realm get together. Get them time to consolidate. This election coming up in July is going to be a pretty easy one for ZANU-PF. What we've really got to think about is going to be 2023. But if that plan for the transition, which would link aid and democratization, has been thrown out the window by Mnangagwa, then what kind of leg does the West have to stand on? Zimbabweans remember very well that in the 1990s, when structural adjustment came into Zimbabwe, almost a decade later than it hit the rest of Africa, because in the 1980s, Zimbabwe was cushioned from structural adjustment because it was keeping the communists out. It was saving that space for South Africa. It was making sure the SACP and ZAPU couldn't play their game in Zimbabwe. So they had a bit of a cushion. They got deeply in debt by spending too much on all these social democratic aspects, education, and so on.
The question I want to know, Prof, I'm sorry to interrupt, because we are quickly running out of time, and I wanted to cover a lot of things, is what happened to the relationship between Zimbabwe and North Korea?
Well, I guess they did their business in the 5 Brigade in Gukurahundi. I don't think that one will come back. I think Trump's sort of... But now, okay, so if the West has been kind of sidelined because this election is going to come into place, what's the role of China? Much of these diamonds have been going to China. And China has also been assisting in this command agriculture thing, which Emerson Mnangagwa says is a great thing. And they raised the prices artificially for maize so that farmers would produce a lot of maize. Now there's a connection here with a company called Secunda. It's a bit blurry, but it doesn't look like that sort of thing could be sustainable. However, if the Chinese do come in, they could subsidize agriculture, get things moving.
Visitor, the president there spoke about reimbursing farmers whose land was taken. But if you are going to build an economy, everybody should sacrifice something. Where is this money going to come from?
I must admit that statement caught me completely by surprise. I mean, it has been the mantra, rhetoric, and of ZANU-PF throughout this period, particularly around from 1998, that there would never be compensation to white farmers. Perhaps Mnangagwa is what de Klerk was to South Africa, in the sense that you realize what needs to be done, and you realize that you need certain reforms to be done. The status quo is unsustainable. And if Professor Moore is correct that there has to be re-engagement with the West, and this re-engagement is a quid.
Well, they're already talking about going to the IMF.
Yes, and that re-engagement with a quid pro quo of opening up the democratic space, allow people that have no liberation credentials or no relationship with liberation politics to participate in politics as you open up the space. And those who colonized Zimbabwe and who made certain promises to fund the land reform process, because Zimbabwe honestly will not have the money. We cannot spend a lot of money solely to pay white commercial farmers as opposed to immediately responding to immediate needs of hospitals and schools. While that is important, perhaps it might not be an immediate need because hospitals and schools are collapsing. So there is a responsibility of the Western world, in particular the British, to
just hold that thought. Let's take this call from David. He's still on the line. David, good afternoon. Phoning from Bloemfontein. Good afternoon and welcome to Rights and Recourse. Hello, David. Are you there?
Yes,
Yes. Speak a little bit faster, quicker, because we're running out of time.
Yes, I hear your topic. But I am not happy today.
No, sorry, David. We'll come back to you at some later stage, but let's continue with our program. Dr. Rupiah, let me come back to you. Could you then say to me, if reports that President Mugabe has been offered $10 million lump sum payment, his full salary is made, not that I say he must not be given those kind of things. Where is this money going to come from to pay President Mugabe $10 million, which he probably deserves, and compensating the farmers?
Dumi, let me say this. Go back to the land question before coming to your question. On the pension, the 10 million, 5 million up front, and the other 5 million being paid in installments. The land reform question in Zimbabwe is central in terms of colonial grievances, also during the previous government and going forward. And curiously, it is only Mnangagwa who can make a decision, which he has done, in terms of, on the one hand, announcing that there is not going to be setbacks on what has happened in terms of land reform, and on the other hand, indicating that the government, the new government, is prepared to pay compensation. So he's trying to create a middle ground. And I've had conversations, with the international community, who are prepared to step forward and support that kind of position. So going forward, I think if Zimbabwe maintains its integrity in terms of the position adopted by the new president, we can actually begin to go forward, pay some compensation, get pieces of land, be bankable forms, within the banking system, going forward. But on the pension, the money is in the Reserve Bank. 10 million, is money that the Reserve Bank can, is able to afford. And I'm told that the president, will receive 5 million upfront, and that was part of the conditions to stop the impeachment. If he had allowed the impeachment to go forward, he would have then moved out without benefits. But the country, Dumi, is able to pay $10 million. They have that money.
Dr. Moore, the other thing that concerns me, a source said, this is a quotation I got from one of the newspapers, President Mnangagwa wants to refine the indigenization policy, widely seen as a barrier to the much-needed foreign direct investment.
Well, this could be a bit like the debate within the ANC. Do we have radical economic empowerment or inclusive economic empowerment? And look, I think the West is never a reliable ally. I think many people in the West think Mnangagwa is going to be another Paul Kagame. Now, you would then have to compare the way the military in Rwanda has worked and that sort of developmental project, along with another, genocidal history. You'd have to compare those. Maybe they're apples and oranges, not two apples. It's up to the Zimbabwean people, who have had a long history of pushing for this little bit of democratic space, to push it further. The people who made that constitution, who put in that impeachment clause that this military regime had to resort to, they're the people that we should be celebrating now. Civil society, the opposition parties, they're going to have to push a lot harder. They're going to need support from wherever they can get, from South Africa, from South African civil society, which actually did intervene in very interesting ways up until the government of national unity. The ANC itself, business, we can't just look at this one man and this one man who took over from another man and who encapsulates the party, the state, business, the military in one person. That's got to start to unravel.
The other thing is, somebody was saying Mugabe was always going to be granted immunity because those who toppled him are equally guilty and complicit in the crimes committed. Let's not try to rewrite history. Mugabe did not destroy Zimbabwe alone.
I think that's absolutely spot on. And not only that, Mugabe was going anyway, if anything, by reason of age. He was not functional. So the celebration around the demise of Mugabe is important, but it has to be put in a proper context so that we properly understand where we're going. This represents an opportunity that Zimbabweans must never allow the democratic space to close again. They must remain engaged in politics, because what usually happens in periods like this, and the history of the French Revolution tells us that after a period like this, which appears like a benevolent coup, people tend to disengage in politics and concentrate on their economic well-being, because any semblance of economic revival pushes people now to say, let me concentrate on my economic being and my family. It has been a long history. So Zimbabweans need to continue to be thoroughly engaged in politics and insist on the opening up of the political space. And again, history tells us that once dictatorships reform, they are unable to control that reform, and that reform will ultimately at some point lead to a revolution.
What's going to happen to the G40?
My sense is that political parties are factions. So ZANU-PF is a faction, the MDC is a faction of society. So this represents a defeat of a particular faction in ZANU-PF. And therefore, there will also be a time when this defeated faction will regroup and come back again. What we know is that liberation movements have the tendency of fighting, and in particular ZANU-PF, it has a history of fighting and always at some point coming back together. So I wouldn't completely discount the G40. They have the advantage of edge.
Dr. Moore, there's a list that we are told it's some form of cabinet of President Mnangagwa. It's not been confirmed, but this is widely circulated on social media.
Well, social media does play a role these days. We saw the This Flag movement and led to Workers Stay Away in 2016. It's hard to say, but it looks like there are some elements of the MDC, some elements of the other one or two from the other faction. And let's just hope that this transitional government can work it out up until the middle of next year through the Congress of ZANU-PF in December, and that space won't close down.
Well, as you all know, we cannot solve all the problems from Zimbabwe on this program and on today. Time is running quickly out, and this program is repeated on Monday morning at 5 o'clock. From all of us in the studio here, we say good afternoon. Thank you very much.